AP 120, Chapter 19, Topics, Internal Female Reproductive Organs. So, the female reproductive system has a lot of functions. It needs to produce female hormones such as estrogen and progesterone. It needs to produce and maintain the oocyte. It needs to transport the oocyte to the site of fertilization. It needs to provide a favorable environment for a developing fetus down in the uterus. And of course, give birth. Expel the fetus when it's now an infant. All right, the ovaries are the primary reproductive structures of the female. They are solid ovoid structures found in the pelvic cavity. During prenatal development, so back when the female was a fetus, they produced millions of these primordial follicles. Primordial follicles consisting of a primary oocyte surrounded by protective follicular cells. And so that means the female produces all of their oocytes before they are even born. Then this process of the primary oocytes entering meiosis pauses until puberty. And then it will begin once again. So by the time puberty is reached, the female has only 400,000 oocytes remaining, so from millions to 400,000. And then during the female's lifespan, they will only release approximately 400 to 500 oocytes. So definitely going for quality over quantity. So oogenesis, the production of the oocytes. So again, at puberty, the oogenesis begins once again. The primordial follicle has within it the primary oocyte, and that pre-egg cell has 46 chromosomes. And then they have to go through meiosis to cut that back down to 23. So at puberty, the follicle-stimulating hormone gets released that will stimulate the production of a primordial follicle into a primary follicle, where the follicular cells divide around the oocyte. And then from there, it will further develop into a secondary or preantral follicle. This secondary follicle, again, has a much, much thicker layer of the follicular cells that are protecting the oocyte. Then that secondary follicle will develop into a mature follicle that has a large fluid-filled space. And then the oocyte is somewhat isolated with its special corona radiata, the follicular cells that are going to stay with the oocyte. And the oocyte also has a layer of glycoproteins called the zona pellucida, which help to also protect the oocyte. During the development of the mature follicle, the oocyte will divide, giving two cells, a secondary oocyte with 23 chromosomes and a polar body. The polar body has 23 chromosomes, and that's about it. So it gets discarded, and the secondary oocyte will not only have the 23 chromosomes, but also most of the cytoplasm. So it's a very large cell within the mature follicle. Here you can see normally within a female's oocyte, there are multiple mature follicles at various levels of development. Turns out it actually takes about 300 days for a primordial follicle to become a mature follicle ready for ovulation. So there are some queued up within the ovaries. And the most mature follicle usually erupts, usually leads to ovulation approximately every 28 days. Sometimes a mature follicle may not rupture and instead develop a follicular cyst, a fluid-filled structure associated with the ovary. It is non-cancerous, but it can cause bleeding and pain. All right, ovulation. Ovulation occurs when the mature follicle ruptures, releasing the secondary oocyte with its 23 chromosomes and the cells surrounding it, the corona radiata, into the pelvic cavity. This is triggered, ovulation is triggered by a burst of luteinizing hormone, by a high concentration of luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. So high amounts of luteinizing hormone cause ovulation. And if the oocyte is not fertilized after a certain amount of time, it will degenerate. So we know that during meiosis, there needs to be two cell divisions. So the secondary oocyte still needs to divide again. Turns out this occurs only when it is fertilized by a sperm cell. So only if the secondary oocyte begins to be fertilized by a sperm cell will it divide a second time, leading to the mature oocyte, which then becomes the zygote because it now has the DNA from the sperm, and a polar body that gets discarded. 23 chromosomes, that's it. The new cell has the majority of the cytoplasm and is an extremely large cell. So the zygote, the fertilized egg cell, is an extremely large cell compared to most cells of the body. All right, here is the ovary. Here is the uterine tube. The uterine tube connects the ovary to the uterus. It used to be called the fallopian tube. We will not use that term, and if you use it, it will be counted wrong. The uterine tube is suspended by a broad ligament and leads to the uterus, hence the name. Initially, the very beginning of the uterine tube, it is not attached to the ovary. It is separate. So when the ovulation occurs, the oocyte ends up in the abdominal cavity. But then these little finger-like projections from the uterine tube are lined with cilia, and the cilia will beat, and that beating will generate a current that will draw the oocyte into the uterine tube. So it'll then enter the infundibulum, the widened area of the uterine tube, and then continue to travel gently down the length of the uterine tube because of the cilia lining the uterine tube that is beating, generating the current that draws it toward the uterus. It is also worth noting that fertilization usually occurs in the uterine tubes. So the sperm usually have to travel through the uterus and into the uterine tubes to find the oocyte and have fertilization occur. The uterus is a muscular organ found in the pelvic cavity. The top 2/3 of the uterus is referred to as the body. The bottom third is the cervix, and the cervix pushes in somewhat into the vaginal space. The uterus is a muscular structure with 3 layers to its wall. The innermost layer is the endometrium lining the inside adjacent to the uterine cavity. The myometrium is the thickest middle layer made up of smooth muscle tissue. And then the outermost layer is the perimetrium lined with blood vessels and nerves traveling to and from the uterus. Cervical cancer. Cervical cancer is cancer at the cervix region of the uterus. Starts off with what's called cervical dysplasia, where the cervix sort of has a abnormal growth in cells, develops an abnormal shape. Sometimes it returns to normal, sometimes it progresses to cancer. The purpose of a pap test or pap smear is to take a tissue sample of the cervix and look for the abnormal cells that may be a sign of cervical cancer. Now, many cases of cervical cancer are caused by the virus HPV, and nowadays there is now a vaccine given to children to prevent them from suffering from HPV, and it turns out that this vaccine has indeed worked because the incidences of cervical cancer are going down. Fewer women are getting cervical cancer. There will always be some cases because it can be caused by other things, but now there's fewer cases. All right, the vagina. The vagina is a fibromuscular tube that extends from the uterus to the outside. Its jobs include conveying uterine secretions out of the body, receiving the penis during sexual intercourse, and serving as the birth canal. The vaginal wall, again, has 3 layers: the inner mucosal layer, the middle muscular layer, and the outer fibrous layer. The vaginal orifice leads to the outside, and when a female is born, there is usually a little bit of tissue called the hymen that slightly obstructs the vaginal orifice. This hymen is actually an extension of the mucosa layer of the vagina. That is it for this part of the lecture.